George Megalogenis is known as a big thinker about Australian politics and culture, searching beyond the noise for what's really going on in our country. He has 4 decades' experience in the media, including time in the parliamentary press gallery. In his new book, 3 Shocks: Who We Are Becoming in the 21st Century, he looks at the seismic changes underway that will influence us all in the coming decades. I'm Conrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, featuring weekly in-depth conversations with fascinating people. Megalogenis joins us today to talk about immigration, long an interest of his as the son of Greek migrants, along with the feminisation of the workforce and the unreliability of both our great ally in the United States and our great trading partner in China. As always, he brings fresh insights that shift perspectives, as they do in this conversation with Good Weekend senior writer Gay Alcorn.
Welcome, George, very much to Good Weekend Talks.
Thank you, Kate. It's a privilege to be here with you.
Lovely to have you. Look, you're known, rightly as a big thinker in Australian politics and culture, trying to sort of look beyond the noise and what are the actual trends. And your new book follows that pattern, and it's called 3 Shocks: Who We Are Becoming in the 21st Century. So, briefly, what are the 3 shocks that you've identified in this book?
Yeah, I was looking for a framework to explain a lot of the chaos that we're living through today. And you could almost have a checklist of about 20 or 30 things that are changing right before our eyes. But I wanted to focus on the 3 things that fundamentally alter our conception of Australia. So our sort of colonial and first century Federation Australia is a very, very male-centred, whiter than the norm, certainly diverse compared to other countries, but white, male. And the third part of that equation was always that someone had our back. Great Britain, up until the loss of Singapore and the Second World War, and then straight afterwards the United States. So the 3 shocks, doing them in order. The first shock, and it's an identity shock, it's not necessarily a negative shock. It can be you can view these things as positive shocks, and the first 2 are certainly positive shocks. The first shock is we are, again, a majority migrant nation. So more than half the population was either born overseas or has at least one migrant parent. And we're the first English-speaking country to return to majority migrant status. We were majority migrant up until the 1890s, and at the turn of the 20th century, when the 6 colonies federated to form the Commonwealth of Australia, we'd sort of crossed that threshold to what I would call majority old Australian. Now, old Australia I define not by age, but by time on country. Both your parents were born here, so essentially 3 generations or longer on Australian soil. So we've moved from majority old Australia to majority new Australia. Now that threshold was crossed quite a while ago now. If you think about the politics of the previous decade when we had that revolving door of prime ministers, we've crossed that threshold in 2018. The second threshold we've crossed, identity threshold, identity shock, is the feminisation of our economy. So the largest group of workers now, and this has been the case for the last 10 years, for more than 10 years now, actually. I'll give you the date in a sec. It's quite an unintended political joke, I think, the culture played on the system, but I'll sort of bury my lead and wait for the end to give you the date. The largest group of workers by occupation are professional women. So they got a tertiary degree and they're working across the profession. So doctors, lawyers, media executives like yourself. Now, when was that threshold crossed? So 2015, it's quite interesting. The very quarter that Tony Abbott was about to lose his job as Prime Minister, our most macho Prime Minister, by all accounts, even probably by his own account, that was the quarter in the charts where professional women overtopped men working as technical or trade workers. So essentially the tradie was replaced by the professional woman in 2015. Now think about what that means for the conception of Australia. So Australia has always conceived of itself as a male-centred. So all our prosperity is bound up in men working with their hands, sort of shepherds, gold miners, shearers, manufacturing workers. They built the snow, they built automobiles. And of course, in the early part, at the turn of the 21st century, when the great mining boom comes, that's sort of sourced in China, they're doing 2 things at the same time. They're digging up the quarry again, and they're also because the construction workforce is a big part of the technical and trades workforce now, replacing the manufacturing jobs are the builders, the physical builders of our apartment towers, of our sort of gleaming corporate towers in the capital cities, and also the big expanse of our suburban frontiers. So those two things, to my mind, really force us to rethink who we are. Majority migrant with an economy centred on the labour of women. But the third shock, and this is the negative shock. So the first two shocks force you to reconceive Australia, actually broaden your definition of Australia. The third shock is really the thing that unsettles us. And I think this thing unsettles us even more than AI and climate, which are really confronting challenges. The third shock is the fact that no one's got our back anymore. We're now operating in a world of capricious allies and trading partners. So both China, our largest trading partner, beat up on us during that COVID period under Morrison's government. And Donald Trump, we know, in both his first and his second presidency, has tried to poke Australia in the eye, try to gouge us with tariffs. He had a prickly, almost first introduction to the Australian Prime Minister after he became president, Malcolm Turnbull. Remember that telephone call was leaked for the world to hear?
It was. Malcolm Turnbull's been talking about it ever since.
I interviewed all the prime ministers in this period for the book. Obviously Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison, and Anthony Albanese. And Malcolm's got his own transcript of that conversation, and we went through them. There's not that much difference, but there are a couple of things that sort of finesse to make Trump sound a bit stronger and make Turnbull sound a bit weaker.
Right.
That's the third shock. The third shock
is also about identity in a way too, isn't it? They're all about identity, the three.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But in our region now, a region that, both major parties, there's a definitional issue here about whether they are major parties or not. There's been a consensus. It was contested early on in the Keating period, but certainly Howard followed it up, that we want to get along with all the countries in Asia. And in fact, the way we build alliances, whether in a group sense or a one-on-one sense, it's with an eye to the future in case there's a threat coming from the region and the Americans don't have our back. There are a whole lot of other countries, like-minded countries, not necessarily democracies in the same way that we view ourselves. But you look at the relationship with PNG, now has an NRL chapter to it, defence relationships now, defence cooperation relationship with Indonesia, all along the Pacific Rim now. A lot of Pacific nations are sort of revisiting Australia's soft power. They want football stadiums built, but they also want favoured status for their migrants. And they also want climate change taken seriously. All these things have pretty much been uncontested the last 20 or 30 years. But the big shift in our region, which is part of this identity shock of either with the US not being reliable and maybe the Chinese, depending on what mood we find them in, Beijing's I'm talking about, not Chinese Australians, they can be capricious. The big guys are now throwing their weight around. And in that world, because we haven't had to live in this world before. We have been majority migrant before. We certainly don't have a society centred on the labour of women before. We've had 10 years to get used to that. It's been coming for 30 years, but we've had 10 years to see the absolute numerical manifestation of that. But the third part of it is, from the First Fleet all the way through, you would think, to the APEC that Howard hosted in 2007, when everybody was competing for the affection of the then Chinese President Hu Jintao, and George Bush is coming in on another night, and Howard doesn't want to meet him because he wants to be at the Dally M Awards. That world no longer exists for us. That world of sort of benign superpowers, even if they're competing, they both used to wake up every morning and unconsciously go to work each day trying to shape the world in their image on Australia's behalf. They're certainly not doing it now.
All
because,
right.
Yeah, that's a long way of explaining the thesis. But I think
makes
you're
sense to
right.
me how they're all identity.
Yeah, they're all identity.
Yes, they are.
But they're all unsettling in the sense that we've had close to 2 centuries of thinking something else about ourselves.
One thing I didn't know, actually, that you say, let's talk about the immigration one first. You say Australia's we're a bit unusual, and you mentioned that we're now approaching 55% of the national population being new Australians, as you call them, like at least born overseas, or you've got a parent who's a migrant. And in 2026, the equivalent figures for first and second generation migrants in the US and the UK was less than 30%. So we're a bit unusual in our majority migrant population.
Yes.
So I'm an old Australian.
Yeah.
You're a new Australian.
Yeah.
What's the difference? Why does it matter?
Why would that matter to us? It really shouldn't matter to us because certainly since the post-war migration boom, which is the programs of assisted passage that both my parents came from separately from Greece in the 50s and 60s, there's no problem in a sense when you think globally in terms of how Australia manages large migration intakes and the cohesion equation on the ground. Like you still to this day, there have been some terrible, terrible incidents, obviously Bondi being the most awful, where you wonder whether our cohesion is what it was. But even adding that into the equation, I still see Australia as a cohesive society relative to the countries we compare ourselves to, UK, US, especially Canada and New Zealand, which are a lot closer in sort of democratic conception to us than maybe the Poms or the Yanks. So in a way, you wouldn't worry about it, but where it becomes problematic for our national identity is once you move to majority migrant, think about where most of those migrants live. And most of those migrants live in Melbourne and Sydney. So Melbourne and Sydney, between them, are 40% of the national population. Now, that unto itself is actually quite unusual because you look at Greater Manchester and Greater London, respectively the second and the most populous cities of the United Kingdom, they're less than 20% of their population. Toronto and Montreal are a bit closer to 35% odd. You don't get the equivalent in New Zealand because Auckland is such a big city, and the second city is, it's essentially Melbourne to Geelong. So that 40% has political implications, especially now that the last couple of federal elections have been decided in Melbourne and Sydney. But more than half of all the migrants in Australia and their children and their local-born children live in just Melbourne and Sydney. So if you were to draw up the ethnic face of Australia, but you drew up two ethnic faces, so you had your Melbourne and Sydney ethnic face, and then you had everywhere else, you actually find for the rest of the country, it's still majority old Australian. And that's because most of the migrants are concentrated in Melbourne and Sydney. And it's where the population growth is, where the jobs are. But the other part to it is, and I use this analogy of the family tree. The family tree is sort of the visualization of this data. So you don't have to have a maths degree to be able to understand it. I visualize the Australian people as being represented in a family tree. We're first Australian roots, Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, an old Australian trunk, so time on country, at least 3 generations, both your parents were born here, and the branches of the family tree are migrants and their local-born children. Now, as I say, majority migrant nationally, that the branches now contain up to heading towards 55% of the population. The family trees of Melbourne and Sydney combined are about 2/3 in the branches. But the family tree of the rest of the country is still over 50% in the trunk. So if you've got 2/3 of your family tree in Melbourne and Sydney in the branches, it means you've got less than a third, because you've also got to account for the roots. Less than a third is old Australia, but old Australia is the majority everywhere else. So this isn't a two Australias thesis. Where it gets interesting and complicated and challenging and, for some people bemusing, for me, I'm inspired by it because suddenly everywhere is different in Australia, and everywhere is different. Australia has some challenges, but what you would build if you learn how to connect these different parts of Australia is something could be quite magnificent if you can pull it off.
Yes.
But the tops of the family trees, the largest overseas-born group, is now pretty much different everywhere you look.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Melbourne, India.
Migrants from India and migrants from China are the second largest.
Yes.
Sydney, migrants from China are the largest and migrants from India are the second largest. Where are the Poms in this? They're the third branch of both family trees. In Perth, the English migrants from England are still the largest group.
Okay.
As they are in Adelaide, as they are in Hobart, as they are in every provincial city in Australia bar the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast has the New Zealanders at the top, as does Brisbane. And by the way, Darwin has migrants from the Philippines and Canberra has migrants from India.
Wow.
I actually love that mosaic. And
Okay.
one of the reasons why I love that mosaic is for the previous 200 and something years, and this is why majority migrant is there are multiple identity shocks within the concept of majority migrant. Up until around 2009, 2010, did not matter where you lived in Australia, the English were on top of every family tree, capital city or regional town.
Yes. The political implications that you talk about are that, I'll quote you, Melbourne and Sydney decide who runs this country.
Yeah.
And that's a shift. And
Absolutely.
that's because they are attracting most migrants and than the rest of the country, and they are the epitome of new Australians.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So just quickly, there is a physical manifestation of this. So when the Electoral Commission every sort of 2 rounds does it checks the population and makes sure that all the seats have roughly equivalent numbers of voters in them. When they redistribute the boundaries for changes in population, the long story from the 80s through to 2010, which is really the long story of internal migration to Queensland and then the mining boom after the turn of the 21st century, Queensland picks up 6 seats in net terms over that long run. And it picks them up pretty much at the expense of Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia. And WA picks up a couple of seats as well at the same time. But since the sort of turning of the sort of population clock in Australia from the mining boom of the first decade of the 21st century to the migration boom of the second decade of the 21st century, that's when Melbourne and Sydney start to come into their own again. And it's not that New South Wales is picking up more seats. It's just the boundaries of Sydney are extending further and further into what was previously rural and regional New South Wales or provincial New South Wales. But Melbourne has been picking up seats because of its population growth. By the way, also Canberra has been picking up seats. So in that sort of cosmopolitan axis, that little Bermuda triangle of diversity between Sydney, Canberra and Melbourne. Canberra doesn't decide elections, but Melbourne and Sydney now have the numerical weight, especially if the Liberal Party aren't competitive in those seats, have the numerical weight to basically give Labor landslides.
Okay.
At the expense previously, because the political centre for the previous 20 years was Queensland.
Politically, it's also fascinating because the Liberal Party in the last 2 elections have just collapsed in the major cities, collapsed in Melbourne and Sydney. And I think their review said there's no way back to government without the cities. We can't win. And they've also obviously lost some Teal seats too. So can you talk about a little bit about the Liberal Party, how it even works in this new identity that you've outlined in your book? I mean, how does it, if they're flirting with one nation, and obviously we'll get to that too, there's a bit of tension around immigration and the pace of it and whether, and that's globally, not just here. But what's the crisis fronting the Liberals given your the data and how you've described it about how Australia actually is now, what our real identity is?
The first two shocks obviously have electoral implications. It's a majority migrant and also an economy centred on the labour of women. Now, we can visualise on election night 2022 that second shock. We can absolutely visualise it in the half a dozen seats that went to Teals, and they're all professional women. So you saw Allegra Spender on election night and Zoe Daniel, although she lost a seat subsequently, Monique Ryan, Kate Chaney. And you would have seen then and there, when you're watching that election night coverage, that the centre of Australia, as politics understood it, had shifted. But the centre of the real economy had shifted years earlier. And this is really one of the reasons why I play around with these identity shocks. I use politics as a bit of a sort of, the train's delayed. Like the track's laid out, but the train takes a long time to catch up with where Australia actually is. And the Liberal Party have had warning of the sort of leaching of the female vote over to Labor. And remember, one of the reasons why women used to vote coalition in overwhelming numbers through the Menzies era in the 50s and 60s, even in the Fraser, the 70s, is you're looking at a traditional Australian family unit, voting household, dad working full-time, may or may not be a Labor voter. Certainly if he's if he's a trade union member, is likely to be a Labor voter. But if he's a professional or or small business operator or is a farmer, they're likely to vote Coalition. Mum's at home raising the children. And mum doesn't go back to paid work. Raising the children is work, of course, but she doesn't go back to paid work until the youngest has turned 6. So until the youngest is, on average, this majority don't go back to paid work until the youngest has entered primary school. In that world, there's a couple of things were going on. Certainly the Coalition had a really, really strong hold on mums at home in middle-class families. But the other thing was migration. And this is something that was always a surprise to me until I could figure out the why. Women were more resistant to the post-war migration wave of the 50s and 60s than their husbands were, because the men were working with the migrants and were getting on all right. Migration was still a concept that you could be terrorised by if you read the account of the latest knife crime from somebody in the so-called ethnic community in the 50s and 60s. So for the mum, that Australia was a little less familiar. So when you get the sort of great feminisation of the workforce, and it really does begin in the 70s. So a couple of things have happened. Obviously, the pill in the 60s, but then also Gough. You think about Whitlam and free university education, which really spits out this in a good way. This spits out this cohort that a previous generation of women, their expectations were to work for a few years, get married, have kids, and then not really re-engage with the workforce. That big change in the workforce, which occurs through the 70s, 80s and 90s and reaches its sort of inevitable conclusion with professional women as the largest group of workers, those women are switching to Labor votes. They're becoming Labor voters because Labor is obviously a party that's more anchored in the trade union movement, even if the trade union movement is declining. Now, Labor, as terrible as it looked when it lost the 1996 election, during that wipeout when Paul Keating pretty much lost the suburbs and lost the regions and was just left with the inner cities, that's about the only place where they held their seats, they had already made the decision to switch to the quota.
Yes.
The quota comes in 94. Now, I argue, and others may want to challenge this fact, but I argue that Labor almost learnt to win despite itself because the quota forced it to diversify its parliamentary ranks.
You've also got a very interesting interview with Paul Erickson, the campaign director for the last couple of elections for Labor, who talks actually about the strategy. Can you talk a little bit about that? The strategy of actually attracting women, a bit of resistance within Labor, and how he pulled that off.
Yeah, there was certainly a bit of resistance. So Paul Erickson had worked as the deputy national secretary through those losing Shorten campaigns, 2016 and 2019. And coming out of the 2019 campaign, because remember that was the one Labor thought was a lay-down misère for them because the coalition had just sacked itself for the second time and Scott Morrison wasn't that well known and there were a lot of people, heading for the exit or a lot of senior ministers were not going to recontest and it looked like there was a smell of death about the government. By the way, Scott Morrison himself told me a very interesting thing in his interview. He said the situation, I'm paraphrasing now, was so diabolical that those that remained in the party had no choice but to be unified. And that actually released him to be able to run that strategy, which basically outflanked Labor because they held their base in the regions and
Yes.
Labor didn't know where to look in the cities for those extra seats that were begging to be taken. Now, coming out of that election, Labor did two things. There was the post-mortem, which was written by Craig Emerson and Jay Weatherill. Craig Emerson, former minister and also former federal minister and also economics advisor to Bob Hawke in the 80s, and Jay Weatherill, former South Australian Labor premier. They did their review, the what went wrong. It's quite, of all the post-election reviews I've read, including some of the secret ones, this was probably the one that was most honest because it said whatever we've been doing hasn't worked. We now need to look at Australia as it really is and maybe park some of our assumptions and have a rethink about what the purpose of the Labor Party is. After the election, Paul Erickson and one of the Labor pollsters, Campbell White, then did this great big who is the voter we need to get into government? What have we been missing? Where is the political centre? What is the median voter? And they came to quite a counterintuitive conclusion, and it was more about maximising the people who were already coming into their column, which was women, not professional women, by the way, but women in the caring sector, who, to all intents and purposes, are working class. Some of them may have a tertiary degree, but most of them don't. Now, the numbers of those workers, and then I went and had another look at the data for myself because I didn't have the full report. I had his research detailed to me by Paul himself. When I mentioned earlier professional women outnumber male tradies, which is essentially the qualified part of the workforce, the semi-skilled part of the workforce, the head-to-head between a labourer, again, a guy who works with his hands in the construction sector, a labourer, or a carer, a woman working in childcare, aged care, a nurse, may not be qualified, may not have a university degree, especially older nurses who don't have university degrees. The carers outnumber the labourers.
Okay.
And that wasn't the case even 5 years ago. And
it's
Ericsson,
a cold pitch for them.
Yeah.
I think he said our voter is a 38-year-old woman.
Well, she is to all intents and purposes a woman in the suburbs. She is a carer and to all intents and purposes working class. Yeah, she's not a professional, by the way. So I think people got a bit bamboozled by the Teals on the night of the election and thinking that this is how Labor won its election. Labor didn't win the election that way. Labor won the election because women of all ages and of all income groups and of all qualifications all swung to Labor, or every age group swung. The coalition lost every group in that election. You asked me before about what was, why the Liberals didn't understand the cities. The composition of the workforce in the cities, forget the diversity part for one bit, the composition of the workforce in the city is not men working with their hands. The dominant driver of economic activity now is the services sector, not the physical manufacturing or building sector. That doesn't mean that mining doesn't create a lot of income for the nation. It does. It's just not a big employer. And I think that part of real Australia was lost on the Liberal Party, partly because they didn't think they needed a quota. And by the way, going into their three successful elections, 13, 16 and 19, the coalition had fewer women in the lower house, MPs, than Howard did in 96.
Mm-hmm.
And think about the changes in the intervening 20 and 30 years, and suddenly you still think you want to be 80-20, like 80% blokes, 20% women, and the women themselves are not prominent apart from Julie Bishop.
Yes.
It doesn't, it doesn't add up.
But can you reflect maybe a little bit more on contemporary politics? But they're going through these sort of conniptions and pulling themselves apart over both immigration and Australian values. Do we believe in multiculturalism or don't we? They're still talking about whether they should have quotas or not. They've completely collapsed in the cities. Their female vote is catastrophic. I mean, where do they go?
Now, the Liberal Party, knowing that they've had this problem for a long time, haven't culturally been able to adjust as Labor, I think, adjusted. There was almost an automatic stabiliser through the quota that made their caucus, even when they were losing elections, look more like the country it was seeking to represent. And of course, this difference manifests itself in the 2022 election, where you've got Scott Morrison trying to win another election on his own.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the big breakout in the Me Too movement, which happens, in COVID. You've got a climate change issue also coming at him as well. And you've got the Matigarean government, those sort of the three factors that are driving the Teal campaign. But something more than that was also going on. Coming out of COVID, you had this crazy situation where people were at home and getting paid to be at home. So the guy ended up getting more money than the part-time mum, let's say in a household. So let's say your traditional two-income household, dad's on full-time work, mum's on part-time work. He gets all his JobKeeper. She gets less than he gets. Both of them are working at home. And guess what he's asked her to do? Because we know the stats have shown this. He's asked her to do more housework now that the two of them are living together. He hasn't chipped in. On average across the population, I'm not trying to stereotype or even generalise, but on average across the population, the coping load of remote learning for kids and all the other stuff in managing those sort of COVID lockdowns, in and out of lockdown through those 2 years, fell disproportionately on women. Also, the job losses fell disproportionately on women. And so for Labor, you think about it, you can reach the correct conclusion by the wrong path. And they sort of came at it by the wrong path. And they didn't realise that COVID, I think when Ericsson presents his research in 2020, he's not thinking that COVID's going to act as an accelerator, cultural accelerator for Labor. Not in his wildest dreams. I mean, he's a very smart bloke, but he's not a prophet in that respect. Those of us, yourself and myself, sort of covering this at this period, you sort of sense something had really shifted in the country, but you couldn't really count it until it happened. And you then had to do your electoral maths working backwards. And here's the luckiest break, by the way. The luckiest break Anthony Albanese had was the delay of the first budget, the first COVID budget. It went from May to October. They gave him an extra 6 months to process this research from Ericsson and Campbell White. And it also gave him an idea that when I do my budget reply speech, I'm going to have to properly product differentiate to signal to women, the true middle, the true swinging voter, the ones who are sort of leaning towards us, but we want to build supermajorities with. I want to signal to them that I'm on your side. And the very first thing he did in budget reply was universal childcare.
Yes, yes.
And that was, by the way, poor old Scott Morrison, that was the first assistance tap they turned off, was free childcare. So at the time that the coalition were moving you back to you're out on your own again because the virus is gone, Albanese is pitching universal childcare. And it didn't seem, to all the hard heads in the gallery at the time, it didn't seem like, the earth had moved. But he'd laid down a marker that was going to make Labor more competitive than it had been in any previous election for the previous 20 years.
So in the bigger picture, what's the danger of all this? I mean, you talked about how you found it interesting that Sydney's different from Brisbane and different from Perth and so on. But is there a danger in I guess, a political danger or a cohesion danger in sort of concentrating old Australians in certain areas and new Australians in other areas? Do they talk to each other?
Yeah, so the map at the moment looks like Australia's polarising, not just by place and by income and education, but by identity. So it does look like the electoral map is polarising. And when you think about where One Nation has suddenly gone from, 6-8% at the last federal election, depending on when you're looking at metro or non-metropolitan seats, to, consistently tracking in the 20s and at some point, competitive, equal to or even above Labor. Look at the last state election in South Australia, and this is where this is an actual election as opposed to this poll or that poll, no disrespect to the pollsters. But in that actual election, the One Nation primary vote is almost identical, it's 22.9%, to the primary vote they got at their very first state election in Queensland in 1998. And how did those seats distribute? So again, you always have to look at seats. There are 33 seats in Adelaide, in the South Australian Parliament, in the lower house, and 14 outside. Labor won 32 of the 33. They picked up an extra 5 off the Libs, and the Libs were left with just one seat in Adelaide. But in a number of the sort of older, less diverse electorates on the outer suburbs of Adelaide, One Nation are finishing second. And that is a concern for Labor at that boundary, at that sort of the sort of boundary between the city and the regions. In the regions, though, it's interesting. Labor only went into the election with 2 seats in the regions, and they held those 2 seats. Bear in mind, Malinowskis has won a landslide because he's won 32 out of the 33 seats in Adelaide. One Nation have won 4, the Libs have won 4, and Independents have won 4. So South Australia, for good or for real, gives you the template for what a federal electorate might start to look like if One Nation do make those inroads at the coalition's expense, and you get essentially in the regions, where 1/3 of the Australian population lives, 2/3 live in capital cities. So even just think about those 2/3, 1/3 divides. If you have One Nation concentrating in the regions and threatening Labor in some provincial towns like the Hunter, that electorate, former coal mining area, or think about some of the wider parts of Sydney, so the electorate of Lindsay, or maybe the outer north of Melbourne. They could pick up a couple of seats there, but what is happening in the cities is to me more interesting because that's still where the elections are decided. And this is what really concerns me, but the collapse of the Liberal Party. Because the Liberal Party at the moment are now so spooked by One Nation. Essentially what's happened to the Liberal Party is that their city-based vote has given up on them. It's either gone to the Teals or Labor, and a few sort of hanging around, but they've only got one seat in metropolitan Melbourne, only 3 in Sydney, only 1 in Brisbane. In Sydney, by the way, they've got 3, but the Teals have got 4, and Daly makes it 5. So they're outnumbered in the cities by the crossbench. So they're not a major party in the cities anymore. One Nation bobs up, and essentially Conservative voters in the regions coming out of that last election are looking at the coalition thinking, they're not going to win an election anytime soon, and I'll never vote for bloody Labor. So I'm going to send a smash the system signal. And you saw that in SA, because in South Australia there was no conception of the Liberal Party even being competitive at that state election. They had leadership issues before the current leader. So in that, this is a long way of answering your question, but if you think about if that polarisation continues, and you're looking at city-based voters, more diverse, more gentrified, and some of the inner city electorates as well, because you're not just looking at Labor with a lock on the migrant electorates. You've still got Teals and you've still got Greens. You look at the city-based voter where the taxes are collected. This is even before we go to the identity question. And you look at people in the regions where some of the services are being delivered from the taxes raised in the city. How do you hold that country together if the people in the region are saying, you're a bloody bunch of city slickers and you're not real Australians, we're the real Australians, and by the way, net zero migration, by the way this, by the way that, climate change is a hoax, the transgender insurgency. Can you imagine how you hold that country together if that's the level of discourse between the parties of the city and the parties of the regions? I mean, a lot of this is on the Liberal Party, unfortunately.
Yes.
A lot of it is on the Liberal Party. Once they lose the city and there's no path back to majority government for them, what do? They're going to chase One Nation in the regions to see if they get out Pauline. John Howard had this dilemma in 98, but coming out of that Queensland election, how did he answer the problem? He went for the GST. He went to repolarise the electorate in an economic contest between Labor and the coalition.
Yes. He focused on the economy. Yeah.
Basically took her off the table. Angus Taylor hasn't quite got that memo yet, because in his budget reply, he had a good idea in there, but he also wanted to cut migration.
Yes.
So if he just said in his budget reply, by the way, I'm not even going to pay any attention to Pauline Hanson, I'm going to tell the people that used to vote for us in the cities that I'm on their side again. Last point, and this is the bigger risk of polarisation in the long run, especially when a Labor government, even if they become the natural party of government and they get tired and they end up like the Victorian government and just end up like the Victorian Labor government. What happens to the electorate at that point? Could you see a situation if the Teals have already shown you one part of the map can switch from a major party, traditional major party, never lost an election in these seats, to suddenly electing and then re-electing professional women? Is it possible that in the western suburbs of Sydney or the west of Melbourne or the northwest of Melbourne or the southeast of Melbourne, is it possible that in the southwest of Sydney, is it possible in these electorates that suddenly migrant communities decide, well, Labor hasn't been paying attention to me. Anyway, Labor are about to lose this election. Why not elect one of my own? When you get that polarised, and this is the thing that really bothers me in the future, there's not an anti-immigrant comment at all. By the way, I'm a child of migrants, but I don't want every tribe in Australia electing their own MP.
Yes.
And I certainly don't want every tribe in Australia signalling to foreign nations who, routinely interfere in other people's democracies that my vote is not an Indian Australian vote or a Chinese Australian vote. It is an Indian vote or a Chinese vote or a Muslim vote. That faction in 2025 that we're running as Muslim Vote, the Muslim Vote faction, well, read your constitutional history. Our constitution was designed in a way to leave there's no formal religion in the Australian Constitution. And in those federation debates, Henry Higgins, bless him, he was one of the ones who insisted that line be put in. He ended up being the first chair of the Arbitration Commission who came up with a living wage. You don't want to live in that country. You don't want to live in that country where you've got a multi-party system but also a multi-ethnic political party system. Again, I would certainly cheer Daly's election and Fowler, but I think Labor losing Fowler for the long run is the thing that they would worry about more, which is a repolarisation of the urban electorate between whites and non-whites.
Okay. On that sober note, thank you very much, George. I really enjoyed your book. I just think it brings together some ideas that we're all going to have to grapple with as we've, changed so significantly in such a brief time, really. But thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Gay.
To enjoy more in-depth journalism from the latest edition of Good Weekend, visit us at theage.com.au or smh.com.au. This episode was produced by Conrad Marshall and edited by Tim Mumry, with technical assistance from our executive producer, Tammy Mills. Lisa Muxworthy and Tom McKendrick oversee our podcasts, and Melissa Stevens is the editor of Good Weekend. If you enjoyed this episode, follow our podcast and leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. And thanks for listening.